Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Congdon. I teach at Vanderbilt University. I want to start by saying thank you to the organizers of this conference. Putting on a conference, a digital conference of this magnitude is a huge undertaking, and I'm really grateful to the organizers for making it possible. If this had been in person, it would have been difficult for me to be there. So I appreciate it being in this format. The title of my talk is Are Moral Facts Loopy? This is based on a written version. And if anyone's interested in seeing the written version, which is very much a work in progress, feel free to email me at the address listed here. So the problem I want to get at concerns a stretch of literature concerned with the moral critique of ideology. I'm going to take as my primary interlocutor here, Sally Haslanger's work on this topic. And the problem I want to set up gets going when we think about two claims in combination with one another, both of which I'm very sympathetic to, but there's a kind of puzzle that arises when you put them together. The first claim is that many, if not all, social phenomena seem to be discursively constructed. Haslanger defines discursive construction in the following terms in Resisting Reality. Quote, something is discursively constructed just in case it is the way it is to some substantial extent because of what is attributed and or self-attributed to it. In her technical vocabulary, she uses the idea of a cultural techne, which refers to conceptual schemes in a very broad sense, dispositions of mind, habits of perception that provide a kind of grid or framework of intelligibility for dealing with the world, for sorting it into categories and being able to move within it and view it as legible and intelligible. However, these cultural techniques or conceptual schemes are not just in our head, they go on to shape and structure the actual resources that make up the social world itself. But since the resources, the material and non-material resources that structure the social world are shaped by the cultural techne we bring to bear on it, there's a kind of what she calls a looping effect where those resources go on to reinforce or naturalize the initial cultural techne. Now this happens in all sorts of cases, but the main case I'm focusing on here is the case of ideology in the pejorative sense of ideology. So the feedback loops of discursive construction reinforce ideological conceptual schemes. And here we can give a concrete example, one used often by Haslanger. An example of a cultural techne would be a kind of ableist ideology, one that doesn't take into account the various ways in which human beings need to be able to move through space and sometimes need various and plural forms of access. An ableist ideology doesn't just exist in our heads. It's not just like a bias that has a purely psychological status, but it actually exists in the way it shapes and structures the resources that make up the social world itself, examples being buildings without access and sidewalks without curb cuts. But as we move in this world that is shaped by this cultural techne, by this ableist ideology, that trains our habits of thinking. If we live in a city without curb cuts, we won't see people using wheelchairs and they'll sort of recede into the background. They can become socially invisible in pernicious ways. That can then go on to reinforce and naturalize the initial ableist ideology. So that's a very quick sketch of the idea of a feedback loop and the way in which discursive construction of social facts can start to create this kind of reinforcing, self-fulfilling aspect of unjust ideologies. Now, the second claim that that is important to getting this problem on the table is the claim that ideology critique, so the critique of, for example, ableist ideology, presupposes certain moral facts. And this is something that Haslanger herself is also committed to. She writes that the presupposition that there are some moral facts cannot be avoided by those engaged in justified political resistance. Now, here's where the question really starts to get going. It seems to be the case, and Haslanger accepts this, that our access to moral facts is mediated by our existing conceptual schemes or the cultural techne that we bring to bear on our perception of those moral facts. And these conceptual schemes are constantly changing. So here's our question. Are those moral facts themselves discursively constructed? Are they themselves the result of the development of and like the historically changing mediation of the conceptual schemes and cultural techniques that we use to think about the world and make it intelligible in various ways. And if they are, how is it that those moral facts can still do their critical job without getting caught up in the same ideological loops that Haslanger is rightly concerned about? So that's the basic setup. Are moral facts discursively constructed, or in the phrasing of my title, are moral facts loopy? So here's another way to put this question. If ideology is characterized by a loopy relation between the cultural frameworks we rely upon to make sense of the world and the resources that structure the world itself, then moral critique of ideology must somehow escape the loop. But how does this happen? Now, the issue is that appealing to moral facts is not straightforward here. On the one hand, Haslanger says things like the following: if ideology is to be judged in terms of the injustice of its effects and the values it promotes, it would seem that there must be a fact of the matter about what is just and unjust, good and valuable. That is, the ideology critic has to have some sort of normative basis for criticizing the loop in question. And that takes the form of moral facts in her terminology. However, she also is committed to this idea that culture, so these cultural techniques, culture shapes what we value and our reasons for action. The point is not just that culture shapes what we take to be value, that is, our beliefs about value, but what is valuable. So at the level of value ontology, culture and discourse and discursive construction can have this kind of constitutive effect on what actually is valuable. And it seems as though this should extend to the kinds of moral facts that the ideology critic would rely upon in order to criticize ideology. So the question is how that can be the case and still have moral facts maintain their critical bite. One example of an appeal to a moral fact, and this is one that comes once again from Haslanger, and this is one that we might really naturally and actually is historically brought to bear on the case of the critique of ableist ideology, is to invoke something like the full rights of personhood. So an example of an appeal to a moral fact, we might say in response to an ableist ideology that then structures the social world such that various forms of access are lacking in an unjust, sometimes humiliating, or at the very least in discriminatory way, that this is a violation of the full rights of personhood, which people with disabilities enjoy. And that appeal, the appeal to the full rights of personhood of people with disabilities, is a moral fact. It's not something that can just be constructed in and out of existence relativistically. But the question is, how do we square that with the idea that culture shapes what actually is valuable? So here's just another version of the question. Can moral facts be discursively constructed and still do their critical job? Here's my sort of diagnosis of the problem so far. If discursive construction refers only to sorts of causal feedback loops at work in the sustaining of ideology, then we face a dilemma. Moral facts must either A, escape discursive construction altogether. That would be to go for a kind of like, for example, Platonic view of moral facts, where they are just outside the historical flux that characterizes social facts. They are there, they have a kind of like absolute status. And so we need something like that, with that kind of strong ontological status to appeal to in our critique of ideology. Or B, those moral facts bear no more or less rational authority than the ideological social facts they oppose. So that would be the worry that if we acknowledge that moral facts are discursively constructed, well, then that seems to just lapse into a kind of relativism where, well, we could discursively construct the moral facts with whatever we want. We can say, well, if we live in a culture where people with disabilities aren't regarded as persons with the full rights of personhood, then their moral worth has just been discursively constructed away, and there's nothing really we can do about that. But, and here's my suggestion and sort of the turn towards the more positive aspect of my paper, the model of causal feedback loops is just one form that discursive construction can take. We can think about moral facts as products of rational discursive construction. And that's the main contribution I'm trying to make in this paper. And I elaborate more in the written version of the paper, is to try to draw a distinction between causal discursive construction and rational discursive construction. So in the brief time I have left, I'm just going to very quickly introduce the idea of rational discursive construction and try to suggest that it might provide a way out from this problem. So what is rational discursive construction? The way I want to introduce it is by suggesting that unlike other forms of discursive construction, it is normative in both of two senses. First, it has an epistemically normative aspect, meaning that the discursive act of labeling, attributing, or categorizing aims at picking out genuine features of the object of discursive construction. That i.e., the discursive act has objective purport. Secondly, rational discursive construction is also developmentally normative. This is a phrase that I'm using to refer to the following idea. The object of discursive construction matures, becomes more subtle, better defined, or in some other way undergoes positive development or growth as a result of its being labeled, categorized, or predicated in a certain way. And the crucial idea is that an instance of discursive construction only qualifies as a case of rational discursive construction if it meets at least both of these two criteria. Now, before we come to the case of moral facts, I want to at least give an example where I think that it's natural to use the idea of rational discursive construction. I want to come back to the personhood example in a moment, but at least just to get started, consider an example where Charlotte finds new words to articulate a bond of affection she has for friends. They picture somebody who's kind of struggling to put into linguistic phrases the way she feels about her friend. And then there's a kind of shift where she realizes there's a set of concepts, a new set of words she can use to newly articulate this friendship. And it seems like it's onto something. Now, this is, I think, an example of discursive construction because there's a sense in which the friendships are kind of sensitive to the way that they're described in a way, like trying to articulate who your friends are, what your friend means to you is not just like describing some neutral object that remains the same. Talking about our friendship, especially with our friends, can change the friendship in question. So in that sense, it seems to qualify as discursive construction according to the definition we saw earlier from Haslanger. But it seems to be normative in both of these senses, which is in an interesting way. On the one hand, it's epistemically normative. Charlotte still has to be in some way like discerning or faithful to the way her friendship really is. So she's not just making things up about her friendship, but presumably she's trying to actually articulate genuine features of the friendship that might have gone missed or unarticulated or remained inchoate if she hadn't tried to find the right words to articulate the way she felt. So in that sense, there is an epistemically normative dimension. But there's also what we might think of as a developmentally normative dimension. I might think that the friendship doesn't just undergo any change whatsoever as the result of Charlotte's efforts to put it into new words, but actually matures because it becomes something more subtle or more refined. In a way that it wouldn't have if she had not gone through this effort. And we have this experience all the time. We sit and talk with friends and sort of hash things out. And the friendship, what we're doing, we're just simultaneously trying to be objective, trying to figure out what's really going on, maybe after a fight with a friend or something. But that conversation itself can sort of spur on and develop the friendship in new, mature ways. So that's just a kind of very more intimate example of a case of rational discursive construction. That's just to get us the very idea that we do have this notion of rational discursive construction that applies in some areas of life. The question is, can we apply it to the case of moral facts? And that's what I'm going to suggest. There's a stretch of Charles Taylor's writings that I find really helpful for solidifying this idea of rational discursive construction. He uses the word articulation to refer to this. He distinguishes between descriptions, which target self-standing objects that are unaffected by their expression in language. So if I talk about Mars, saying that it has an iron-rich surface or is 4,208 miles in diameter, I can say those things, or we can express facts about Mars, and those are not going to change anything about Mars itself. It transforms our understanding of Mars, but it doesn't transform the actual planet. On the other hand, he contrasts descriptions with articulations, which target inchoate apprehensions of value and importance, which can be affected by their expression in language. So if I, again, have this vague sense of affection for someone, and then I start to put into words, that may not leave the object unchanged. It's not like my inchoate sense of affection is like a planet waiting to be discovered. It actually is sensitive to the concepts and words that I use to describe it, and can actually evolve and mature in various ways and become more determinate as I put it into words. Here's two quotes from Taylor on articulation. Taylor writes that, quote, "Articulations are attempts to formulate what is initially inchoate or confused or badly formulated, but this kind of formation or reformulation does not leave its object unchanged. To give a certain articulation is to shape our sense of what we desire and what we hold important in a certain way." He also writes, "Articulation here alters the shape of what matters for us. It changes us." So what I'm proposing, and this is going to be really quick because of the confines of this presentation, is an analogy between the two cases. On the one hand, we'll call now case A, Charlotte finding new words to articulate a bond of affection she has for a friend, which we just noticed was both epistemically normative and developmentally normative. And case B, the articulation of the concept of personhood over the course of human history. So according to this analogy, it would be the case that the articulation of the concept of personhood that we might use and bring to bear in cases of ideology critique is simultaneously epistemically normative. So when we start trying to come up with words and conceptual frameworks that articulate the kinds of the moral value of persons, we actually are trying to grasp something that's really there prior to the act of articulation itself. And yet, developing those new conceptual frameworks can have a kind of maturing effect where we grant those values themselves greater determinacy, and they can make possible new forms of valuing and new forms of meaningfulness in a human life. So just to spell out the case B instance a little bit more, what would it look like to think of personhood as an object of rational discursive construction? Well, one of the ways human beings have tried to articulate the sacred or inviolable worth of human life is through the concept of personhood. That concept is not static, but evolves over time. For example, the rise of modern racism in the period of classical European imperialism and the emergence of capitalist forms of class-divided society demanded the articulation of previously indeterminate dimensions of the value of humanity. I mean, I want to say it at a kind of ontological level, those needed to be sort of stitched together for the first time in response to those crises and forms of injustice. As the concept of personhood evolves, so does the value of humanity it strives to articulate. It makes who we are more subtle, more determinate. The new articulations make possible new forms of valuing humanity or modes of rational responsiveness to its violation and injury that would have remained undeveloped, inchoate, or unrealized without them. That at least is a very quick sketch of what it would mean to take this example as analogous to the friendship case. So coming back to the main question, are moral facts discursively constructed? Well, obviously this analogy by itself isn't going to do the trick, but at least I hope to have made like intelligible the following possible conclusions. If we mean that they're being shaped by the sorts of non-rational causal forms of discursive construction at work in the sustaining of ideological social facts, the answer is no. So if that's all we mean is causal forms of discursive construction, then we can't have moral facts be discursively constructed without lapsing into kind of relativistic picture. But if we have in mind this idea of rational discursive construction, then the answer might be yes. There's a lot more to say to actually defend that. This brings up all kinds of questions about how we judge moral progress and what exactly the foundation of these moral values is and how that can undergo historical change. But I hope to at least provided a kind of very basic framework in which we could start to pose those questions. So thank you so much for listening. I really look forward to discussing the paper with you all at the conference.